let's get started. First of all, happy Mother's Day to all of you who are mothers out there. And I'm glad to see a number of you joining in and planning your meals later, if that's how you're going to celebrate today. I also wanted to start by asking, how is the reading going for you? Anyone, any comments on the reading you've done so far?
I love the book. I think it's great. And I never had thought about that period, you know, that 200 years. It's fascinating. So thanks.
Yeah.
Not that I remember it from day to day, but I really enjoy reading it.
Good. Not always on your mind.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anyone else? Okay.
Well, that's how I can. Sometimes I'm irritated. There you go.
Okay. And I was hoping we'd get at some of that. You know, it's important to know where our edges are and what's coming up there. What are you experiencing, Herman?
Well, I think sometimes they protest too much. I mean, so they didn't use the exact name Christian, but they were clearly identified with Jesus. So anyway, they seem to, and you know, we've heard from missionaries how when people leave their, like, especially in India, when they leave their faith and become Christian, how they get cut off from their families. I mean, this isn't just a phenomenon of that time. So, and then they kind of present these communities as lushes in these chapters today, which I think is, I mean, they were not wealthy people in general. So it's not like they were, you know, Romans having these big feasts and things. But so that's it. I just I just am not convinced entirely by what they're trying to do in that.
Okay. All right. John?
Yeah, excuse me. On one level, I read the book and I thought, well, duh, meaning, yes, that's the way things are when you introduce a new subject into a culture. The culture expresses its own, let's say, understanding and manifestation. So there's an obvious level to the book. Well, to me, what's one of the most exciting things is to go back and look at that obvious level, because we look at the organized level that has happened afterwards. And the all crazy things, the Celtic culture came to my mind, because the Celtic culture did not have Christianity enforced on it by the Roman Empire. It had a missionary, let's call him for lack of a better word, come in there, and the culture then said, this is how I see it. There is one danger in the book, though, that I have to keep reminding myself is, don't read back into the culture our cultural response to the same kind of issue. They may not have had certain cultural issues that are very important to us. So there is that little danger, and I think every once in a while, the authors kind of slip in that thing and they use our culture words and our culture interpretation. But I wish kind of everybody of the Christian, self-confessed Christians would have a chance to have fun with the book.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of Herman, I think the way I see it is that these churches were not creedal. You know, I think that may be part of what the authors are pointing out, you know, that this is the way it was before. What my friend Alice Glover says, these men got together in the back room smoking their cigars and coming up with the creed. This was before that, and it's just really interesting to me to think about. And it was all okay, that they could have these different groups. They didn't necessarily agree. They didn't seem to think a creed was really that important, except that they were followers of this man named Jesus.
Mark, I think that's a really interesting point. I'm reminded that Bart Ehrman's book, which covers the same period, is called Lost Christianity. So in terms of Herman's first point, Ehrman considered them Christian groups because they were followers of Jesus, even without creeds, in some contrast to our book here. And I guess it's not really a critical point what they're called, but it's an interesting point.
Mm.
Well, I mean, it is clear that, after Constantine and the church became something quite different. That's clear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I thought today, because there is a real arc. They are. It seemed to me they jump around some, and it was helpful to me to go back and say, this, they really are moving in a direction not only with sequential meaning, but also with their focus on these communities during that time, which is the essence of this period of time in terms of the formation of what we today would understand to be Christianity. So I thought I'd do a really quick summary of last week's discussion, because I know a few of you weren't here, and then we'd move into the continuing discussion of communities. So let me try to do this. Okay. So the issue, we started with the issue of violence, and that the Romans were not known to single out religions that exist, practice them in relative safely as long as there wasn't trouble, right? And that Jesus and Paul lived during a relative lull in violence in the Roman Empire, and that there were other much more brutal times, particularly for the Jews, and that would come again in 66, current era, with the Roman assault on Jerusalem after a number of Jewish uprisings in response to starvation, taxation, and individual assaults. The assault ended in 70 CE with the destruction of the Second Temple, the mass enslavement of Jews. I think they said there were 100,000 who went to Rome alone and participated in building the Colosseum and other structures, and many, many deaths. So about midway through that, the Jews started fleeing Jerusalem, and the temple, which, as you all know, was the central place in Jewish life. It was the only place where sacrifices were allowed. It housed the Holy of Holies and other scriptures. That was destroyed, and it was no longer the center of Jewish life. And in diaspora, not surprisingly, I think, is that they started forming smaller communities. And some of them were more quiet than others, but others were outspoken in their claims about Jesus as the anointed one or king, which challenged imperial theology, and power was seen as posing a threat to power. So they joined these for a sense of belonging, community, hope, resistance, protection, even survival. And some structured in unusual households, sometimes with experimental, non-patriarchal structures that the people talked about as reflecting more of the teachings of Jesus. The communities were Jewish. It was late 2nd century before the scholars anyway note any significant addition of Gentiles or non-Jews into the communities. And their identity was very much Jewish. Paul himself argued that his teachings fit within the Jewish tradition, including ideas of resurrection and the apocalypse, the end time coming. We talked about the tension in Paul's writings and writings that are attributed to Paul, and really, I don't think very many people believe they were Paul's anymore. So the letters do reflect both the leadership and importance of women in the communities and the continuing cultural tensions with keeping women under male authority. There is also just a note, we didn't go much into the apocalyptic understandings that people believed Paul had, which was the end time would come within the lifetimes of the people who he was writing to at that time. And so there is scholarly analysis that says a lot of the things like, don't worry about marriage, slaves don't worry about being free from your masters at this point, because they believed it was all going to be over with. In their lifetimes, they were going to see that. Helen Bond, who's a New Testament scholar who focuses on women, has a caveat about making too much of the lasting power of women being leaders and treated equally within the communities. And that is that as time moves forward, and it's clear that the apocalypse is not going to happen in their lifetimes, and maybe not in the first, in any future that they will see, that and as the communities grow, there's greater concern for how they're received in the larger culture. And so women are actually slowly pretty much returned to their previous roles. That's Helen Bond's take. Okay, so 50 years after Jesus's death, there are about 20,000 people, they believe, no specific count, of course, in the Jesus movement. And as Herman was pointing out, they're mostly not wealthy people, although some of the communities had benefactors, which were. As also mentioned, no doctrine has been created, many different understandings of who Jesus was. But the stories of Jesus's death in particular stand out during this time because they're starting to ask questions. Who was Jesus? What does this mean? And you see the same themes emerging that the Romans used in talking about the noble death. He had died for a greater good, a noble cause for the future and truth. And using much of the same language about the divine characteristics, the kingly nature of Roman theology. And this was to point out that what they had was better and more aligned with what Jesus was teaching. Good news to them came to mean something very different from what we even think of it as now. The good news to the in that time, culturally, it was good news was thought to be a major world-changing event, and not even then did it mean anything material or military wealth. It was generally not of that nature, and it had nothing to do with life in the hereafter. For the Jesus groups, the good news was in the here and now. And the fact that they existed and were caring for each other, being fed and finding a future. And this is how they began to talk about their communities and what was special about them. So in conclusion, there are the authors make the point that this was, as I think you all have picked up on, this was not as straightforward as we were led to believe. The simple narrative of Jesus Jesus dying and resurrecting, and Christianity is born immediately in the light of that it all comes together and makes sense and lasts through the ages, that's not true. And that what we know today is Christianity did not exist in the first 2 centuries. Any comments on that? We talked somewhat about disagreement, resistance to any disagreements with the teachings.
Well, I think you did a great job of explaining it, maybe sometimes better than they did.
Thank you, Herman. Yeah, John?
One of the things that I keep reminding myself is that this movement at first was a Jewish reform movement. That is a movement to reform the Jewish faith, or to clarify it, or to correct it, whatever words you like. And so the analogies of the introduction by Martin Luther, of the items to be discussed was intended not to start another denomination in our mind, but to reform the Roman Catholic Church. So when you're coming into one of these areas, you're actually introducing a variety of Reformed Judaism in my model. It is Jewish, but it is Reformed Jewish. And so you have this tension that's going on between not only the Romans, but the Jewish. The other crazy thing is that on one level, the Romans were more inclusionary. They were perfectly willing to let the Jews, or the Reformed Jews, put idols or whatever they wanted to in a Roman temple, as long as the Romans could put idols in their temple. So I know that sounds crazy, but it looks like this group was really the less tolerant in modern cultural terms. So those are ideas that I play with.
Well, I'm not debating, John, but I think maybe the message in the book is, it wasn't self-consciously a Jewish reform movement. It was more like a survival movement, more like a community that had been, had been taught some liberating news by the Rabbi Jesus. And later it distinguished itself from the Jewish community as a whole.
Okay. I also, I don't know if any of you have thought about the comment of Diana Butler Bass, who is a religious historian, and on this book being akin to the 1619 Project, but it's come back to me a couple of times, that thoughts about how this was that. Has anyone else thought about that, how it is? It may not be like the 1619 Project. Well, it's obviously about the early period. So the 1619 Project, of course, is a retelling of history and of the 400 years before Black people were fully, recognized for and given citizenship rights, at least in name. But also, I thought it was a lot like the thinking of the master narrative and the impact that, master, of course, having connotations of not only being the one that endures most loudly, but also the one of the ones who are writing it, and usually the wealthy and powerful are doing that. So that was another parallel I saw with the 1619 Project. But I also, in a different way, it seems to me that this book is describing a different victim from what many people might have gotten in their sense of early Christian history. It was in the master narrative that I recall, Jesus was the victim and the Christians were the victim. And Jesus was a Jew, but he was introducing a new religion, was the understanding of many of us anyway, I think. Any thoughts, anyone, on that? Okay. All right, let's move on to today's chapters, and we're going to go with again the household, the family descriptions, and then move on into other forms of community and the practices, and finally heresy. I hope we get there. Importantly, I thought it'd be a good point to highlight why these authors have taken the approach that they have taken. And it is because they believe focusing on what was actually going on within these communities is a more reliable picture of Mediterranean life during that period. So it gives us a better sense of what was actually happening in these 200 years. And that Paul's writings are helpful as well in doing this. Okay. Whoops. Did I do that? Yeah. Okay, here we are. Excuse me. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing at this point. Some of you may have a better knowledge of the points they're making about the Gospel of Matthew. Remember, we've already been introduced to the fact that these families were different from the traditional Jewish families, these groups that gathered together in households. But they turn to the Gospel of Matthew, saying that this alternative way of life, that family life, the chosen family that Jesus talked about, was really a central element of the gospel. That they say that the under the household lens, the Gospel of Matthew can and must be read as an ultimate experiment with family, an experiment that in many ways challenges the prevailing social model of paterfamilias in the patriarchal descent. Jesus is an adopted son. And they note, of course, the dramatic and surprising opening line of Matthew, where they give the lineage of Jesus that includes 5 women, which is unusual. And they make the claim that the women who were mentioned, his mother and his adoptive grandmothers, they call them, were women who had to endure social violence, take risks, and express vulnerability to survive. Only 4 of these, or 5 were named there. Would any of you like to comment on that take on the Gospel of Matthew and how it might pertain to the early communities?
Well, hearing nobody else, I was waiting. I mean, that's a very interesting part of the reading today. But also within the Jewish scriptures, these people were highlighted. And a lot of Matthew, which I think wasn't that the last of the gospel? Well, John was after, but it was Mark and Luke and then Matthew. And that was a period where there was beginning to be a tension between the traditional Jewish religions and the Jesus communities. And the author of Matthew read back into the story of Jesus, the prophecies. And so, including those women who were featured in the Jewish scriptures would be consistent with that.
Yeah, Matthew's audience was the Jewish community, right? Larger. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts on that? Okay. All right, well, we also now see that associations, clubs, or guilds, as Dominic Crossan's tends to call them, due to the fact that many of them were organized around crafts, that they were also a prominent organizational form of groups of these Jesus followers. And they're our focus today. So let's see, we were introduced last time to the, I went back to the beginning. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go through a few, no, I didn't. Okay. There was a little hand drawing that we saw in the book about the continuation, I would think, of the communal practice of reclining while eating with one another. And this would seem to me to indicate a pretty wealthy group. But we do have, I believe it is in Matthew, where there's a passage about Jesus reclining and reclining with the tax collectors. So this was just the way relaxation apparently was done. And I guess one thing that I thought about was this would not be recommended today, right? This would be a choking hazard or way of eating. Although these people no doubt died a lot younger than is the norm today. The authors point out that their eating practices were kosher, that they ate their holy food, which had no blood in it. So that was one of the things that we learned in this. Traditions continued in these new communities. And the authors quote another scholar about the importance of the meal. Andrew McGowan says it was the only known practice of Jesus communities for the first 90 years. So people went off and went on their ways the rest of the time. And he follows the changes and the growing communities and how it changed their time together around meals. They started spreading out. It sounds much like what churches would do, right? If you can't feed everyone together, you go to shifts. You have, maybe smaller meals throughout the day. And that this practice began to be discontinued in some communities that grew too large in the 3rd century. And by the mid-4th century, this practice just was not certainly the main point of gathering among these groups. And he says by the 6th century, the vast majority of Christians worshiped in churches without anything but a token piece of bread and a cup of wine. Any thoughts on that?
So
No?
I have a question, Kate, and that is about reclining meals. Does anyone know when they started? I mean, people had chairs during this time.
Yeah. I had seen somewhere in my reading that it started with the Greeks, but, you know, we don't really know, do we? I mean, if we go to prehistory, we wouldn't know. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
No, we've always, I mean, other than that, I know that the Romans, that was their style of eating at the higher level. I don't think it's, I mean, I don't know the furniture. I mean, I just know I should be quiet because I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. John?
One of the keys to me in this whole process is the last sentence that you have on the chart. Unfortunately, I see a model in which that initial enthusiasm and being the follower of Christ, the center of your life, now becomes an element in your life, no longer the center of your life. And that element now takes its own priority position in the other things that are important to you. This kind of formalization is a little bit common when groups start up and that sort of thing. But I think it means more here than in the normal group dynamics. In that the church, let's call it the church for lack of a better word here, is no longer the center. It has a role. It fulfills that role over here, but your social center might be somewhere else. This center might be somewhere else. Whereas initially, I think the group meetings were something that everybody grabbed onto because they didn't have a center to their life. Now I'm reading a little bit back in, but I think that last thing that you've listed here is really worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, we've known for a long time that the early churches were house churches, and maybe by using the word church, that kind of threw us off because they were just gathering. I wanted to add to that last sentence until the Baptists started covered dish dinners. I think gathering around meals has always been a way to build community. And, there's many groups today that will get together once a week for a meal. So I think that's a little bit, I think it's normal that people would come together. I mean, these people were in a difficult situation, and this was a way that they came together to support each other.
I wonder also if these meals might have been a way of recruiting new members, just as churches today have certain meal events which are designed to bring in new people and offer them free food as a way of recruiting. We don't know, but it's possible that was a way of bringing outsiders in to get a meal, have a nice experience, and build the community that way.
Dominic Crossan makes that point in some of his work, Jerry, that these meals were likely ways that the communities grew. And that many of these people, of course, were in rural areas. So they were off working during the day, but they came together in the evenings. And he points out that you could belong to more than one association or guild. So I think that is a factor too. I've also thought that maybe at the end of the day, people were just exhausted, and lying down seemed like a good way to be at the end of the day. But they were largely social. These were times when people told their personal stories, shared what was going on with them. So, okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, so the communities see these benefits grow of meeting in the ways that they are. They're bringing together different kinds of people. We call it diversity, different ethnicities, classes. And but as we come into the epistles, we realize that there were problems as well. And that's what Paul was writing to. He was writing to these communities about the problems that were happening at that time. Some of them were women being silenced and not being allowed to recline, as the men were. Enslaved people, perhaps being denied equal status at the table. And there were reports that there were some clashes between ethnic groups at these dinners. So, and beyond that, of course, we know Paul wrote about relationships and acceptable behaviors at these gatherings. He said, he lists disorder, fighting, unequal distribution of food at meals, drunkenness. You can name them all. These are some of the most famous passages, of course, that we've read. The introduction of, or the centrality of the purpose of their meeting being that they are there as followers of Jesus, the Anointed One. Paul introduces the concept that you're dishonoring Jesus to engage in these behaviors. And of course, he introduces that or preaches to the concept of love, that our unity depends on love. Any thoughts on that? Anything to add?
Well, I thought it was interesting that he talked about how 1 Corinthians chapter 13 wasn't addressed to, individual romantic relationships, but to the community.
Yeah. Yeah. The famous wedding passages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Anything else? Anyone else on that? Okay, I'm going to go to this issue of bathing and baptism.
This is my computer.
So the author's challenge, some of you may have heard this before, I had not, that like the word Christian, that it was, in later times projected back onto this period, the English word baptism imposes a later understanding of the practice of bathing by communities of the Jesus, the Anointed. Bathing was another social relaxed event and a place to talk. And that the more correct understanding of John the Baptist, as we know him today, would have been John the Bather. And Josephus says that, that bathing was a consecration of the body, implying that the soul was already consecrated by right behavior, that those who were doing the bathing were committed to leading these lives of justice and piety. Anyone, any thoughts on that? Is that something you all knew and I didn't? I thought that's a real switch for me. Okay. All right, we get to heresy. The different meanings that there were for it. The original meanings being closer to a choice, a school of thought, a teaching. Later, Tertullian applies this to mean division among the groups. And then later on, it comes to mean it's outside of the bounds of the group, that those who have deviated from the group's true beliefs aren't really members of that community. Okay.
One thought in regard to that, Kate,
Yeah, please.
and again, this is an Ehrman point. Most of the non-Jewish people who gradually came into the Christian communities were pagans, had many gods, often had local gods, and it wasn't difficult for them to just bring in yet another god, the Christian god, into the mix. But Christianity became more and more exclusive, so it became less permissible for these pagans to worship the gods they had worshiped before. And that, of course, both created a tension, was also part of the success and the growth of Christianity, in that it forced these people, if they want to stay part of the Christian community, to shed their other gods. And I just thought that was an interesting point. It kind of relates to what they came in with heresies that maybe initially were accepted and then in time were not accepted. They had to move away from those earlier panoply of pagan gods.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. If anyone else has something to say, please jump in. I can't see you right now because I'm looking at my screen as well. We knew about the philosophical schools, but I had not really thought about them that's what these authors are focused on. And they note that the earliest, I guess, debates arose not about theological issues, but about the practices of the communities. This is a point, it seems to me, that early Jesus movement followers were focused, like the Jews, on what they called orthopraxis, or right practice, doing the right things as opposed to having to believe the right things. And these authors say that that was the unity of these movements. So, but those within